What's your homeowners association horror story? Until a recent coup, our HOA was run by some of the pettiest people alive. Some of their hijinks over the years included sending us a nasty letter telling us that we were in violation of their covenants due to bare places in our lawn. We were in the midst of totally replacing the sod in our yard as part of a landscaping plan the HOA approved. Sending us a violation letter because the trash can had not been moved back inside until 10 minutes after the deadline, 6 p.m. on trash pickup day, because no one has a commute or an emergency or works different hours than the HOA board members. This was sent with a time-stamped photo of the trash can. And my personal favorite, sending us a violation letter that we needed to replace our mailbox because it was damaged and we would be fined $25 a day until we did so. The mailbox was fairly new, so I went out to look at it. It was absolutely covered with bird poop. Cleaned it off and noticed that there was no damage. Shrugged and emailed the HOA that the problem was rectified. They came out to verify that it was, and I got another letter. More bird poop. A few hours of observation revealed that a hawk was perching on the mailbox stalking a chipmunk that was living in the garden around our mailbox. So I went to the garden store and got a bottle of predator pea stuff that scares away small animals and sprinkled it around the mailbox, causing the chipmunk to relocate. Problem solved. Sadly, I did not send the HOA an envelope full of the stuff. Tell us about the coup. We need it in this thread. I was written up for having my hose on the ground while I was in the process of installing the thing to hang the hose on. They literally came by when I stepped inside. My neighbor was also written up for having a box on his porch. It was an Amazon package that had been delivered that while he was at work. Our board was old women had too much freaking time on their hands. Go spray paint their windows facing your house at night so they can't spy on you. Not my story, but a friend's. The HOA had an issue about a painting inside the house. It could be seen through the front windows and they didn't like it for some reason. We were the first house in phase 2 of our subdivision. The developer got lazy and didn't file covenants for P2 until 2 months after we closed. Technically we are not subject to any restrictions. I troll them mercilessly. FB post goes out about no burning trash. Time to light a fire. Second post comes out with VP threatening that he will come put out a fire at your house. Luckily it was freezing cold, so I lit a fire and reported myself at about 10 p.m. Suggested he come put it out. I could go on and on and on. I hate HOAs. I, for one, vote that you go on and on. We've been out of internet and cable since Christmas and it doesn't look like we will get it back until the end of the month since our HOA will deal with the lowest bidder. So it was a new community and my family just bought a house. So once all the other houses got built, this lady says she is going to start the HOA as per our agreement in the contract. So they call for a block party. No one shows up. A month later another gathering at their home. No one shows up. 6 months pass by, call for a meet and greet at the community mailboxes. No one shows up. 2 months later we get a letter asking for dues. Us and our neighbors next door and across the street talk about no one paying and we spread the word to our other 30 neighbors and the HOA died. Haven't heard from them in a few years. No money, no power. Not a HOA, but the renter's agent guy sent me a letter on November 29th saying I had to pay a $100 noise complaint fee because I was up walking around at night. I am a big guy and live on the second story of this small apartment complex. The letter stated that the fee was due by November 26th or else more fees would be applied. It was dated November 29th. Checked my lease to see if they could even charge me the fee, and it said that if police were called, a fine of up to $100 per incident may be issued. Police were never called, just my elderly downstairs neighbors calling the agent and complaining. So a friend of mine's old boss, dude built a successful HVAC supplier, still had his first car, etc. Didn't give a crap about spending the money he has been making. Wife wanted a fancy house, so he bought a McMansion kind of place in the suburbs. A new house, so the trees are young. One doesn't survive the winter, so he takes it out. HOA says you have to replace it. He says no, and one day he gets home and there's a new tree in the front yard and a bill in his mailbox. They go back and forth and eventually all his trees are uprooted and lying in the street. So he takes them to court and tells his lawyer to drag it out until legal fees bankrupt the HOA. Then he replaces all the trees, including the first one that started it all. That's a lot of frick money. Drawing things out legally can get in this very expensive. Replacing the trees after bankrupting the HOA, that's just simply cold-blooded. Most recent one was this year. They sent a letter saying no Christmas decorations until 12/1, and they all had to come down before 1/3. They also sent a wall list of forbidden ornaments, including anything inflated or not in keeping with the spirit of the season. So basically all the light-hearted funny ornaments. Look out the window, kids, it's the Grinch's sad fricking cave. Anyway, we had beautiful weather on Black Friday, but had to wait until things got cold again before we could get out there and put up lights. Then, after New Year's Day, we had exactly 1 day to take down all our lights, and the wind chill was -25. Naturally we decided frick that, there's no way they bill anybody for this, and opted to just leave the lights unplugged. We got a bill before 10 AM on the 3rd. Report everyone else on the street and start reporting the council members for the most petty crap possible. If you catch them dismissing the fines for theirs with justifications, call them out on it. Either people will get angry and either vote them out, disband the HOA, or the council people will end up with so many fines that they will severely back down. My cousin moved into a house with a HOA. They spent several months chasing after him for the former owner's missed HOA payments and threatened legal action. He was not legally responsible, but they kept hounding him. Eventually he lawyered up to stop the harassment. Not an HOA but a neighborhood association, so close enough. 2 quick stories about the same folks. A friend of mine who had a diseased, rotting, falling over tree in his front yard had to request the association's approval to have the tree removed. His request was initially denied and stalled for several weeks because the association wanted professional verification that the tree was actually diseased. A cursory glance at a tree that was practically horizontal in the guy's yard wasn't enough. Apparently, the church I'm a member of owns a house next door to the church. The house has some historical significance and is architecturally interesting, but at this point it's been totally abandoned for years. The family who built the house no longer has any interest in it. They sold it to the church and have no relatives in the city anymore. Because of the architecture and the length of the abandonment, doing anything productive with the house is likely $1 million plus project. But the association has flatly refused to approve any reno plans and simultaneously has refused any notion at all to tear the house down. So the church is stuck with a house that is in increasingly bad shape, totally empty, can't be sold because of its condition, and the neighborhood association will not approve any plan to do anything with the house except leave it alone. And that's why you have a mysterious fire happen at the house. AMD boom, house is gone. My HOA had a Christmas incentive. If you could catch a neighbor on camera not picking up their dog's mess, you would get a monetary reward. The neighbor was fined $100. HOA kept $50 and the person who turned them in got the other $50. There was an episode of The X-Files called Arcadia in which a monster made out of garbage killed everyone who violated HOA rules. I've been scared of them since the late 90s. It's also a fantastic comedic episode. Mulder and Scully go undercover as a married couple named Rob and Laura. I remember that one. The monster was basically breaking into people's houses and murdering them for having the grass uncut or for being out past curfew. He looked like a sludge monster. LOL. That was a great episode. They towed my car from my driveway. There was a post in a legal advice about a guy who had his car towed from his driveway, and he lived in a HOA. The towing company just hooked it up by lifting up the end, but since the car was a Nissan GTR, it needed to be put on a trailer. Guy said the car was shot. Towing companies must make more mistakes than I thought. This is actually something that is ongoing battle between my friend's mom and her HOA, or more specifically one member. She lives inside this circular complex full of townhouses with a roundabout in the center that used to have a lot of trees and looked really nice, almost like a mini park. The HOA decided to cut down all of the trees without giving notice and my friend's mom was pissed. She went to complain about it and they basically said, "Sorry, too late." In protest of them doing that, she decided to buy this big inflatable palm tree that she stuck on her balcony for all to see. One of the neighbors, who was in the HOA, decided to file a complaint because it looked gaudy. She knew exactly who it was and it upset her more that this person did that instead of coming to talk to her after years of living near each other. She was able to keep her tree, and when Christmas came around she even decorated it. She decided she was going to wage this war against the HOA and this neighbor by having annoying inflatable decorations on her balcony. When it started warming up, she bought a flamingo, which she likes to dress in Chicago Cubs or Blackhawks gear depending on the season. I told my friend he should get her a 6-foot wacky waving inflatable tube man to put on there next, which I think would be hilarious, but I don't know if she wants to take it that far. A guy across town put up a flagpole. The HOA told him the only flagpole allowed was a small flag hanging at an angle on your porch. He took the pole down. He did some research on his contract and painted his garage door in an American flag pattern. I hate HOAs. I'd line my front porch with small flags like a UN convention. The HOA association hounded a resident relentlessly to remove the flag from the front of their condo. It was a service flag and they are a Gold Star family. Gold Star, in case people don't know, that usually denotes that an immediate family member died in a war. We get a letter every year telling us it's against the bylaws to have a fence, but the fence was already there when we bought the house. My Bill put his fence up before the HOA was active. His house was the first one built in the subdivision, and he had the fence up quickly. About 6 months later, the HOA was finally formed, and the bylaws prohibited privacy fences, but his got to stay up because it predated the HOA. Little late, but here goes, and it's not my story but my dad's. When I was real little, my parents owned a house in Florida that was part of a HOA. Behind the house was a lagoon or pond or whatever, and the backyard went right up to it. Basically the backyard ended at a little slope that went right down into the water. One day my parents got a notification from the HOA that the grass in the back was unkempt and this was a violation and there would be a fine if he didn't cut it. What they meant was the grass on the slope into the pond needed to be cut, even though that wasn't part of the property. My dad said whatever, broke out the lawnmower and got to work. Just as he was finishing up, a huge freaking alligator comes rushing up out of the water. My dad does the only thing logical. He lets go of the mower and runs. The mower rolls down the slope, hits the alligator, pee it off most likely, and sinks halfway into the water. My dad leaves it there cause he ain't going to mess with no scaly death machine. A week or so later another notice arrives. This time about yard tools being left out, the mower in the pond surrounded by agitated miniature water dragons. And, yes, there was a fine. Dad said, frick em, and refused to pay the fine or any HOA dues ever again, and they added monthly fines for non-payment. Made a point of specifically never paying the HOA every month when he gave the mortgage to the bank. The bank didn't care since they got their money. Who cares about some crappy board? About a year later, when my parents sold the house, the HOA came to collect. Guess what my dad said? That's right, he said, frick off. Take my payment out of the lawnmower if the gator lets you. Then they drove off into the sunset. As far as we know, the lawnmower is still there in the water, guarded by scary dinosaurs. When we first bought our house, dues were $195 a month. 2 years later they raised it to $300. The very next year they raised it to $400. So basically in less than 5 years they raised dues by 100%. Not a HOA story because I live in a small country town, but here's one about our neighbors. My boyfriend at the time, now married, and I had a house on about 1.5 acres and had a tiny little pile of broken branches from a recent storm that had come through. We decided to burn them and sit outside, drink a beer, and listen to music turned way down. It was about 10 p.m. The fire was almost the size of a small charcoal grill, and the music was so low we forgot it was even on. All of a sudden, we're being spotlighted from the road. Turns out, our neighbors had called 911 on us saying we had an obnoxiously loud party going on that had a raging fire and it was getting out of hand. Keep in mind, it was just the two of us. 3 small fire trucks, 2 ambulances, and 4 cop cars later. All of the first responders were sitting around the fire with us hanging out. Our neighbor just about had a heart attack, which would have been good timing since the paramedics were hanging at our house. The president of our HOA was the typical retired military guy who loved to order people around. He would walk the neighborhood with a video camera and harass people who would be too scared of the video to defend themselves. Every possible violation, no matter how small, was a huge personal affront to him. They actually took UPS to court over the trucks being over the line of the designated parking space for guest vehicles. Well, yeah, genius. The delivery trucks are larger than the Honda Fit-sized parking spots. And the HOA freaking won. Our condo had a ridiculously small driveway. I'm talking like 3 feet. The rules said you could not wash your car in the street. If I angled my small car just right, I could have some of it outside to keep the water off the stuff in the garage. Well, apparently the bumper was like 1 stroke to over the curb. The lady across the street ratted me out to the president, who promptly showed up, camera in hand, to chide me for this egregious act and ordered me to pull my car further into the garage. I was so happy to get out of that place. What threats do HOAs have over their homeowners if they don't comply with their ridiculous rules? Certainly they can't call the police. Do they threaten them with fees, eviction, treating them rudely? I am a college student, so I stay on campus most of the year and go home in the summers. I got pretty bored at home, so I set up a basketball hoop in my driveway. I played daily throughout the summer, and when classes started again I went back to campus. In the fall my dad gets a letter from the HOA stating that if he doesn't take down the rim, he will get fined daily. My dad didn't feel like arguing, so he took my rim down. When I came back home for winter break, I went to a meeting and asked them for answers. They told me a basketball hoop is not the image they want our neighborhood to represent. When I threatened them with legal action, they relented and allowed me to put back the hoop. My break ended last week, so I moved back to campus and my dad received another letter from the HOA. This time the letter said a basketball hoop will only be allowed to be kept as long as someone uses it at least once a week. I cannot drive home every week just to play on my driveway, so once again my dad was forced to take down the rim. Now when I go back home for the summer break, I have to rebuild my hoop all over again. Dad takes 1 shot at the basket on his way to work every Monday. Problem solved. They were annoying my mom to repaint our house because the color was looking faded. We had it painted 5 years prior, and although it was yellow and had faded a bit, it didn't look bad at all. Well, my mom finally gave in and spent $3,000 to $7,000. I was younger and don't remember the price, getting the house repainted. 2 days later we get a letter in the mail saying we don't need to paint our house anymore. Needless to say, she was freaking pissed. Yep, didn't need to paint your house because you'd already had it painted. The broadband connection in my development is super slow. I found a company that would be willing to make 1 gig fiber to every apartment for a fixed fee of £5,000 total, not each, as long as we could find 20 homes who would sign up to their package. I found 80 homeowners who wanted it. I also found studies online that showed that increasing the broadband speed from 8 megabits per second to 1000 megabits per second would have a significant impact, like an increased £10,000 each, on house prices. HOA refused it because we have a lot of retired people here who will be confused by it. They then tried to introduce parking controls in the whole area, in contravention of both the freehold and the lease, and started trying to fine people £100 for having guests after 7 PM or for not displaying a parking permit again. The permits were a contravention of the lease. They tried to fine me. I wrote to the other 200 owners explaining that I'm a barrister, highlighted the provisions in the lease, and explained how the management company had overstepped the bounds of the lease. Company tried to sue me for the £100 under some parking contracts that they believed they had created due to putting up some signs. They lost. I then demanded an AGM, as all leaseholders are also shareholders in the freehold of the property and thus, the management company, and demanded a board resignation, or board elections, which were required under the Articles of Association, but hadn't been held in a decade. All 3 directors were fired and we appointed a couple of accountants and professional property managers who live on the estate to take over. The director of the board was in floods of tears. She's a 70-year-old woman whose dad built the estate, and who had lived there her entire life. It was everything to her, but she was clueless. We now have 1 gig broadband. They're not all bad. Mine collects about $250 a year, and uses that to keep up all of the public lawns and trees and stuff. Everyone involved has better things to do with their time than keep up with petty bulls. There was one time a stay-at-home mom decided to take it upon herself to enforce all of the parking restrictions outlined in the HOA agreement. She went around putting warnings on people's cars for all sorts of things. She wasn't a board member or anything. She just felt like power tripping. When she tried to actually get those warnings she issued enforced, the actual board members just laughed at her and moved on with the meeting. So, back a decade or so, and it's my first year in small town American suburbia. I'd immigrated to about a year or two before, from a rougher corner of a far larger city. This was like a whole other world, equal parts cool and baffling, with really great neighbors who had odd customs. It was a good life. Anyhow, a few months after we moved into our first real suburban home, this total stranger comes knocking on the door to talk with me about our HOA responsibilities. But seemed weird to me. I've rented apartments my whole life long. All I know about HOAs is they probably fine you if you don't paint your fence. To the best of my knowledge, our street had no HOA. Also, our house had no fence. Anyway, this guy wanted us to pay our back dues. And of course, I tell him that we don't appear to be members. Does he want to send us some literature? This works on Jehovah's sometimes. Maybe it'll get rid of him too. Frick no, he does not want to. He would like the dues. Please. Are we aware of our legal obligations? It would be best to just settle this all up front. This is the point at which I send my young child well back into the house and reach for a phone. Because it sounds like a shakedown, you know? But it sounds like a shakedown from a movie script, the kind of thing people think other people say. And then comes the best part. I'm from Chicago, he tells me. This is small town tourist Arkansas. Okay, but I'm from Chicago, he says. You know how we do things, right? We get stuff done. And then BSP. So you understand that at this point I'm trying not to openly laugh. Yet, he's pretending to be a freaking Chicago mobster. Like something out of The Untouchables. Was that Chicago? I get my mob stuff mixed up. I can hardly believe he's real. Anyways, I tell him that this isn't even our house. Corporate owned. See, I tell him that I understand he wants dues and whatnot, but I'm honestly not certain that corporate has signed on for this and, really, would he like to send some literature? Perhaps he'd like his lawyer to speak with corporates, so that everyone's clear on what's happening here? I could make a phone call if he'd like to speak with someone himself. Right now, yeah, phone in my hand, mate. Coming to my house in this small nothing town pretending to be something scary, freaking try me. And then BSP. Anyways, had a good laugh with the boss about it later. And again, when some literature actually showed up, hand typed, full of spelling mistakes. Standard look at Emmy Bulls. We never joined an HOA. Our home's contract actually included language prohibiting us from joining an HOA. And the sorry little shitstick never did come back again looking for money. Back when I was about 16 or 17, my friends and I used to hang around the neighborhood. We weren't the bad kids though, but for whatever reason the head of the HOA hated us. Or maybe all teens, I'm not sure. The one time that I'll never forget, I get home from school. It was a normal day, and my mom says to me as soon as I walk in the door, "So the deputy fire chief called me this morning." Now I'm thinking, okay, what's the big deal? Well, apparently some kids had thrown Molotov cocktails all over the neighborhood and Miss High and Mighty Hoa had called 911 and reported it as me and my friends. Well, clearly that was impossible because I was playing Xbox all night that night. So long story short, me and all my friends get called into the fire chief's office one by one to explain our whereabouts that night, and he would just not let up. We all had proof of where we were and what we did, but no, that wasn't good enough because we're just dumb teenagers. It had to be our fault. He even had a satellite image of the crime scene with a red line leading back to my house saying that he had police dogs sniff out our trail. Eventually that finally ended and apparently no one was charged. But fast forward a couple of years and guess who gets caught selling majorly overpriced pool passes to out of neighborhood guests to use our pool? That's right, Miss High and Mighty herself. I was so happy when I read that email, and even more happy that she had to pay back the thousands of dollars she swindled. So that's why I believe in karma. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.